The Antonov An-124 descended through Moscow's midnight clouds like a metallic phantom, its cargo bay housing secrets that could reshape continents. Inside, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless, his weathered hands folded over a pendant that had witnessed 3 generations of struggle. At 28, he bore the scars of a man who had outlived empires, his eyes reflecting the fire of ancestral memory and the steel of modern warfare. The aircraft touched down on a restricted runway at Domodedovo, its presence erased from all official records. No diplomatic protocols, no ceremonial guards, just shadows moving through the Russian winter like ghosts carrying thunder. Traoré's arrival had been orchestrated with surgical precision, known only to 5 individuals within the Kremlin's inner circle. Even Russia's foreign ministry remained ignorant of the visitor who would soon shake the foundations of global power. As armored vehicles carved through Moscow's frozen arteries, Traoré gazed through bulletproof glass at a city that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. The irony wasn't lost on him. A descendant of those who had been colonized, sitting in the belly of another former colonial power, preparing to deliver a message that would echo across continents. The Kremlin's interior chambers had been designed to intimidate. Centuries-old oil paintings gazed down from gilt frames, their subjects, czars, generals, and revolutionaries, seemingly watching as history prepared to turn another page. The meeting room stretched like a battlefield, its mahogany table reflecting the faces of men who had grown accustomed to shaping the world's destiny with whispered words and calculated silences. Vladimir Putin entered with the measured steps of a predator flanked by his most trusted advisors. General Alexei Volkov, the architect of Russia's African strategy, intelligence chief Dmitry Kozlov, whose networks spanned from Cairo to Cape Town, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the diplomatic chess master who had turned international law into an art form. They took their positions across from Traoré with the confidence of men who had never been challenged on their own territory. But something in Traoré's posture suggested this wouldn't be a typical diplomatic dance. He wore his military fatigues not as a uniform, but as a statement. No flags, no ceremonial decorations, just the simple green and red of Burkina Faso's colors, and that pendant, catching the light with an almost organic glow. The translator, a nervous man named Petrov, cleared his throat and began relaying Traoré's words with mechanical precision. The Republic of Burkina Faso thanks the Russian Federation for this meeting. However, we must clarify our position from the outset. Putin's pale eyes narrowed slightly, a barely perceptible shift that his advisors knew well. It was the look of a man sensing unexpected resistance. Traoré's voice, when it came through translation, carried the weight of conviction. Africa will no longer serve as a playground for foreign empires, not East, not West, not any power that views our continent as a resource to be extracted rather than a civilization to be respected. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. General Volkov shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping an unconscious rhythm against the table. Kozlov's expression remained neutral, but his eyes had sharpened with interest. This wasn't the typical African leader they were accustomed to dealing with. Men who came hat in hand, seeking loans, weapons, or protection. Putin leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. Captain Traoré, Russia has always respected Africa's sovereignty. Our partnerships have been built on mutual benefit and, with respect, Mr. President, Traoré interrupted, his translated words falling like stones into still water. Mutual benefit assumes equal partners. When one side provides resources and the other provides weapons to suppress dissent, that's not partnership. That's a protection racket dressed in diplomatic language. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and danger. Putin's advisors exchanged glances that spoke volumes. This was uncharted territory. African leaders didn't typically challenge superpowers in their own capitals, especially not with such directness. But what happened next would shatter the evening's carefully orchestrated proceedings and send shockwaves through the global intelligence community. Sergeant Dmitry Solkov stood near the chamber's exit, his position carefully chosen to provide optimal security coverage. 26 years old, decorated twice for service in Syria, psychological evaluations consistently rating him as stable and reliable. His uniform bore the insignia of Putin's elite protective detail, a unit whose loyalty was supposedly beyond question. But loyalty, like truth, could be purchased with the right currency. 3 days earlier, Solkov had received his final briefing in a nondescript apartment in Moscow's Zamoskvorekia district. The man who sat across from him wore no uniform and claimed no nationality, his accent carefully neutral, his face forgettable by design. The target represents a clear and present danger to global stability, the handler had explained, sliding a photograph across the scarred wooden table. African nationalism, if allowed to spread, could destabilize multiple regions. Economic partnerships worth billions could collapse. Strategic mineral supplies could be threatened. The briefing had been thorough, clinical. Traoré wasn't just a military officer. He was a symbol of something that certain shadowy networks couldn't allow to flourish. His influence had already begun spreading across the Sahel, inspiring other young leaders to question decades-old arrangements between Africa and the global powers. One shot, the handler had emphasized. Clean, quick, blamed on ethnic tensions or religious extremism. The narrative is already prepared. Now, as Solkov watched the verbal sparring match between Putin and Traoré, his hand moved almost unconsciously toward his service weapon. The weight of the Makarov pistol felt heavier than usual, loaded not just with bullets but with the weight of history about to be altered. Traoré was in the middle of outlining his vision for African unity when Solkov made his move. The motion was smooth, practiced, a lifetime of training condensed into a single, fluid action. The pistol cleared its holster with barely a whisper of sound. The shot, when it came, cracked through the chamber's heavy silence, like thunder breaking over a cathedral. Traoré jerked backward, his chair tilting as the bullet struck his chest with devastating force. The sound of his body hitting the marble floor seemed to echo for eternity. Chaos erupted instantly. Shouts in Russian filled the air as guards converged on Solkov, who made no attempt to escape or resist. His face was a mask of anguish as they slammed him to the ground. His repeated cries of, "Forgive me! Forgive me!" barely audible above the pandemonium, but all eyes remained fixed on Traoré's motionless form. Blood spread across his uniform's fabric, dark against the green cotton. Putin himself had frozen, his political instincts momentarily overwhelmed by the raw immediacy of violence in his most secure sanctuary. Then came the moment that would haunt intelligence reports for years to come. Traoré's fingers twitched, then moved more deliberately. Slowly, impossibly, he pushed himself upright. His breath came hard and labored, but his eyes, those eyes that had witnessed 3 coups and 2 revolutions, blazed with undiminished fire. General Volkov audibly gasped. Kozlov muttered something in rapid Russian that the translators would later refuse to repeat. Putin's face cycled through disbelief, calculation, and something approaching awe. Traoré's voice, when he spoke, carried no trace of weakness. "I am not here to die today." With deliberate slowness, he unzipped his military jacket. Beneath it, nestled against his chest, hung a pendant unlike anything the assembled Russians had ever seen. It was roughly the size of a man's palm, composed of what appeared to be stone, but stone that pulsed with a faint organic light. The bullet had struck it dead center, leaving a spider web of cracks across its surface. But the pendant had held. The silence that followed was deeper than fear, approaching something like reverence. General Volkov, a man who had seen combat across 3 continents, whispered, "That's not technology." Intelligence Chief Kozlov, his voice barely audible, added, "Is it radioactive?" Putin's question cut through the whispers like a blade. "Where did you get that?" Traoré met his gaze without flinching. "It came from my homeland, from the earth itself, and from the memory of those who died so we could live free. It was not made by human hands, but it was found by them. My great-grandfather discovered it after lightning struck a sacred hill during the Independence Wars. Some say it fell from the sky. Others believe it was always waiting." He paused, his fingers gently touching the cracked surface of the pendant. "It wasn't made to stop bullets, Mr. President. It was made to protect truth." The room's occupants found themselves confronting something that existed beyond their carefully constructed worldview. This wasn't about politics anymore, or economic, partnerships, or spheres of influence. Something older, more primal, had entered their sterile chamber of power. In Putin's eyes, just for a moment, something cracked. The absolute certainty that had guided his actions for decades. This was no longer East versus West, Russia versus America, developed versus developing. This was memory confronting machinery, soul-challenging system. And it was only the beginning. The secure wing of the Kremlin where they moved Traoré existed in official documents but not in public awareness. Its corridors stretched beneath the ancient fortress like arteries in some vast organism, connecting chambers that had witnessed the planning of invasions, the toppling of governments, and the reshaping of continents. But the guards who now flanked these corridors weren't Russian. They wore no insignia, carried no identification, but their bearing spoke of deserts crossed and battles won in places that existed on no official maps. These were members of the African elite shield, warriors trained not in military academies, but in the harsh crucible of generational resistance. Commander Isa Kane had arrived on the same Phantom aircraft as Traoré, his presence as carefully concealed as his captain's. A former child soldier turned guerrilla strategist, Kane had spent 2 decades building networks that spanned the Sahel like invisible spider webs. His scarred face told stories of survival that no intelligence file could fully capture. "You should have died," Kane said quietly as he entered the secure chamber where Traoré was being treated by Russian medics. "That shot was perfect." Traoré touched the cracked pendant that now lay against his chest like a talisman. "Death isn't always about bullets, old friend. Sometimes it's about forgetting who you are. And I remember everything." Kane produced a sealed envelope from his jacket, its black surface marked with a crimson stamp bearing the symbol of a rising sun. "Ashes of Empire," he read aloud. "Your contingency plan." "Not contingency," Traoré corrected. "Inevitability. They were always going to try to kill me." The question was never if, but when and how. Inside the envelope lay years of painstaking intelligence work, surveillance photographs taken by market vendors who doubled as informants, financial records extracted from embassy computers by cleaning, staff who had learned coding in underground schools, satellite imagery purchased through shell companies and analyzed by former child soldiers who had taught themselves astrophysics. The documents painted a picture of a shadow war being fought across Africa, with multiple players using the continent as a proxy battlefield. Russian mercenaries in the Central African Republic, French special forces in Chad, American contractors in Somalia, Chinese infrastructure loans with strings attached like anchors. But at the heart of it all was a name that appeared with disturbing frequency: Colonel Armand Delacroix. Colonel Armand Delacroix existed in that liminal space between official denial and undeniable influence. Officially, he had resigned from the French military in 2015 following an incident in Mali that remained classified. Unofficially, he had become the coordinating force behind a network of private military companies, intelligence brokers, and economic manipulators who treated African sovereignty like a commodity to be traded. His operational methodology was elegant in its brutality. Rather than direct military intervention, which attracted international attention and domestic criticism, Delacroix orchestrated carefully managed chaos. Tribal conflicts funded with untraceable cryptocurrency, media campaigns that painted legitimate, governments as corrupt or extremist, economic sabotage disguised as market fluctuations. The beauty of the system, from his perspective, was its deniability. When civil wars erupted, they appeared organic. When governments fell, they seemed to collapse under their own contradictions. When foreign peacekeepers arrived to restore order, they were welcomed as saviors rather than criticized as invaders. But Traoré's survival had introduced a variable that Delacroix hadn't anticipated. For the first time, the shadow war was being fought by someone who understood shadows. 2 floors below the chamber where Traoré recovered, Sergeant Dmitry Solkov sat in a different kind of room entirely. The interrogation chamber was sterile, windowless, designed to strip away everything that might provide psychological comfort. The table was metal, cold to the touch. The chairs were uncomfortable by design. The lighting came from strips that hummed with an almost subliminal frequency calculated to increase stress levels. Putin himself had come to conduct the questioning, a decision that spoke to the gravity of what had occurred. The president of the Russian Federation didn't typically interrogate low-level operatives personally, but nothing about this situation fell within typical parameters. Who gave you the order? Putin's question was direct, unadorned by diplomatic niceties. Solkov's face was a mask of anguish. The bruises from his arrest were already beginning to purple, but the real damage was internal. I can't. They'll kill me. They already tried to kill Captain Traoré in my house, Putin replied with icy precision. That makes this personal. The interrogation that followed revealed a network of corruption that extended into the highest levels of multiple governments. Solkov wasn't just a lone operative. He was a node in a system that treated national loyalties as negotiable commodities. The payments had come through cryptocurrency wallets linked to shell companies registered in Dubai, Cyprus, and the Cayman Islands. The operational briefings had been delivered through encrypted messaging systems that automatically deleted their contents. The psychological conditioning had been subtle but thorough, building on Solkov's existing fears about economic instability and global change. But the most disturbing revelation came when Putin asked about the narrative that was supposed to follow. The assassination! They had the headlines ready, Solkov whispered, his voice barely audible above the room's mechanical hum. African extremist killed in Moscow terrorist attack. Burkina Faso government blamed for harboring radicals. International community calls for stabilization mission. Putin's expression didn't change, but something cold and predatory settled behind his eyes. He had spent decades playing the great game of international politics, but this was something different. A metagame where the players themselves were being played. Show me the communications, he ordered. The forensic analysis of Solkov's devices revealed a level of sophistication that impressed even Russian intelligence specialists. The network that had recruited and managed him operated like a hybrid between a modern tech startup and an ancient secret society, combining cutting-edge encryption with old-fashioned human psychology. But it was the discovery of a single, seemingly innocuous file that changed everything. Buried in Solkov's encrypted storage was a document labeled Continental Chess. It wasn't a traditional intelligence report or operational manual. Instead, it read like an academic thesis on the management of African political development, complete with footnotes and statistical appendices. The document outlined a comprehensive strategy for preventing African unification while maintaining the appearance of supporting African development. Its recommendations were chillingly clinical. Identify emerging leaders with genuine popular support and either co-opt them through economic incentives or eliminate them through carefully managed organic crises. support artificial divisions based on ethnicity, religion, or regional identity, maintain multiple proxy forces to ensure that no single government can achieve true stability without external support. But the most revealing section dealt with what the authors called the Traoré problem. Captain Ibrahim Traoré represents a new generation of African leadership that cannot be easily categorized or controlled. Unlike previous generations, who could be managed through traditional colonial frameworks, Traoré combines modern strategic thinking with authentic connection to African cultural identity. His influence appears to be growing exponentially, with young leaders across the continent beginning to adopt his methodologies and rhetoric. Recommendation: immediate neutralization through apparent martyrdom. Death must appear to result from internal African conflicts rather than external intervention. Post-elimination narrative should focus on dangers of African extremism and need for international oversight of regional political development. The document was signed not with names, but with organizational codes that traced back to a consortium of private intelligence firms, defense contractors, and multinational corporations with extensive African interests. When Putin finished reading, he set the document down with the careful precision of a man handling plutonium. "Get me Traoré," he ordered. The second meeting between Putin and Traoré took place in a different room entirely. Smaller, more intimate, designed for conversations rather than confrontations. There were no translators this time, both men speaking, in English with the careful precision of non-native speakers who understood the weight of every word. Putin sat across from Traoré at a simple wooden table, his usual retinue absent. For the first time since the assassination attempt, they were just two men, each representing forces that were reshaping global power dynamics in ways that traditional diplomacy couldn't accommodate. "You should be dead," Putin said without preamble. "I've been told that before," Traoré replied calmly, "usually by people who underestimate the power of preparation." Putin studied the cracked pendant that Traoré wore openly now, its strange luminescence seeming to pulse with his heartbeat. "What are you playing at, Captain?" "No games, Mr. President. Only truth." Traoré's voice carried the weight of conviction that came from absolute certainty. "The West fears Africa because they know we're waking up. You want to use us because you see an opportunity to challenge Western hegemony. But I want something different, entirely." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Putin's face. "I want us to rise, not under Moscow, not under Washington, not under Beijing. Free, sovereign, unshakable." Putin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And if we refuse to support your vision, then we rise alone," Traoré replied without hesitation. "And when we do, without your money, without your weapons, without your protection, you'll discover something the colonial powers learned too late. We were never weak. We were just remembering who we are." From his jacket, Traoré produced a folded document, its edges worn from handling. He slid it across the table with the same deliberate motion he might use to place a chess piece. "This is a comprehensive list of every African leader your agents, NATO operatives, Chinese handlers, and private contractors have attempted to bribe, blackmail, or eliminate in the past 3 years." Putin opened the document, his expression growing darker with each line. Names, dates, amounts, methods. It read like a catalog of global espionage operations spanning multiple continents and agencies. "You've built an intelligence network," Putin observed. "No," Traoré corrected. "We built something deeper than intelligence. We built memory." The document wasn't just a list. It was proof of a systematic effort to prevent African political maturation. Each entry was supported by intercepted communications, financial records, and photographic evidence, bank transfers from CIA front companies, arms shipments from Russian oligarchs, infrastructure loans from Chinese state enterprises with impossible repayment terms. But more disturbing than the evidence of manipulation was the evidence of coordination. The same private contractors who had worked for the Pentagon in Somalia were taking Russian money in the Central African Republic. French intelligence officers were sharing information with Chinese operatives in Burkina Faso. American defense. Companies were selling weapons to groups funded by Russian cryptocurrency. The global powers weren't just competing for influence in Africa, they were collaborating to ensure that Africa remained weak enough to be controlled by all of them. Putin folded the document slowly, his political instincts warring with genuine admiration for the intelligence work it represented. "How long have you been watching?" "Long enough to understand that bullets aren't your primary weapon," Traoré replied. "Long enough to know that the shot fired in this building was just the most visible part of a war that's been raging for decades." He touched the cracked pendant at his throat. "But also long enough to know that we're not just defending against your attacks anymore. We're preparing to go on the offensive." While Putin and Traoré spoke in the Kremlin's secure chambers thousands of kilometers away in Ouagadougou, a different kind of revolution was unfolding in the humid darkness of Burkina Faso's capital. In a nondescript building that had once housed a colonial administrator's office, Amara Kone sat before a wall of computer screens that would have impressed Silicon Valley executives. At 24, she held advanced degrees in computer science and cryptography from universities in 3 different countries, but her real education had come from years of digital warfare against systems designed to keep Africa dependent and divided. The message that appeared on her primary monitor was simple. Phase 2 initiated. Kone's fingers began moving across multiple keyboards with the fluid precision of a concert pianist. Around her, 24 other young Africans worked at similar stations, their screens filled with code, data streams, and communication intercepts from around the world. This was the digital headquarters of what intelligence agencies would later call the Phoenix Network, a continent-spanning information warfare system that had been years in the making. Unlike traditional hacking collectives, Phoenix didn't primarily target financial systems or government databases. Instead, it focused on something far more strategic: narrative control. Pattern recognition indicates coordinated media campaign, initiating across European and North American outlets, reported Kwame Asante, a former Google engineer who had returned to Ghana specifically to join Phoenix. Same story templates, same emotional triggers, same sequence of publication. On his screen, headlines began appearing in real time as news outlets across the Western world started publishing variations of the same story. African strongman sparks chaos in Moscow. Mysticism and military. Is the Sahel losing grip on reality? NATO intelligence warns of new extremist threat from West Africa. The narrative was elegantly constructed, painting Traoré not as a legitimate political leader, but as a dangerous fanatic whose influence posed a threat to regional stability. The stories didn't need to be false, they just needed to be framed in ways that made African political awakening seem dangerous rather than inspiring. But Phoenix had been anticipating this exact scenario. Counter-narrative deployment in 3, 2, 1, Kone announced. Across social media platforms, independent news sites, and encrypted communication channels, a different story began to emerge. Video footage of Traoré's survival, carefully edited to emphasize his calm dignity rather than any supernatural elements. Audio recordings of his speeches, translated into dozens of languages and distributed through networks that bypassed traditional media gatekeepers. Most importantly, contextual information that explained why global powers might want to prevent African political unity, economic data showing resource extraction patterns, historical analysis of similar assassination attempts, comparative studies of other independence movements and how they had been suppressed. The Phoenix Network didn't try to control the narrative. They provided tools for people to understand it. Global engagement metrics are off the charts, reported another team member. We're seeing organic sharing across languages and platforms that we've never achieved before. But Kone wasn't celebrating yet. She knew that the real test was just beginning. Colonel Delacroix's response to the failure in Moscow was swift and multifaceted. Within hours of Solkov's death in custody, operational teams were being deployed across West Africa with instructions to destabilize the region through any means necessary. In Mali, unmarked aircraft began dropping weapons to tribal groups with historical grievances against each other. In Niger, social media bots started spreading rumors about government corruption and foreign manipulation. In Guinea, mining operations suddenly experienced equipment failures and labor disputes that threatened to disrupt global supply chains. The goal wasn't to achieve specific political outcomes. It was to create enough chaos that international intervention would appear necessary and reasonable. But Delacroix had made a crucial miscalculation. He was still thinking in terms of traditional African responses to crisis, tribal fragmentation, resource competition, and appeal to external powers for stability. He hadn't anticipated that this generation of African leaders might have developed entirely different strategic approaches. In Bamako, President Assimi Goïta received an encrypted message on his personal device. The message contained a single line of text: "Unity is our weapon." Within an hour, similar messages had been received by heads of state across the Sahel region. But rather than triggering military responses or emergency cabinet meetings, these messages activated something that had been years in the planning. The Unity Accord hadn't been signed in public ceremonies or announced through traditional diplomatic channels. Instead, it existed as a living network of agreements, protocols, and mutual defense arrangements that could be activated when necessary. As mercenaries prepared to inflame tribal tensions in Mali, they found themselves confronting not competing ethnic groups but coordinated security forces from multiple nations. As economic sabotage operations targeted mining infrastructure in Niger, they discovered that alternative supply chains had already been established through Burkina Faso and Chad. Most frustratingly for Delacroix's operatives, traditional psychological warfare techniques, spreading rumors, exploiting ethnic divisions, creating artificial scarcities, were being countered by information networks that seemed to operate faster and more efficiently than their own. In a secure communication facility in Dubai, Delacroix stared at failure reports from his field teams with growing concern. His operations weren't just being blocked, they were being anticipated and neutralized before they could achieve critical mass. "How are they doing this?" he asked his chief intelligence analyst, a former CIA operative named Marcus Webb, who specialized in African political dynamics. Webb's report was comprehensive and disturbing. "They've built something we've never seen before, Colonel. It's not just political alliance or military cooperation. They've created an integrated information and response system that operates across multiple levels simultaneously." He pulled up a map of West Africa on his tablet, marking locations where Phoenix network nodes had been identified. "Look at this. They have tech capabilities in Ouagadougou, intelligence analysis in Bamako, financial coordination in Niamey, and strategic planning in N'Djamena. But it's all connected through communication systems that we can't fully penetrate." "More importantly," Webb continued, "they're not just defending against our operations. They're using them as opportunities to demonstrate the unity they're trying to build. Every time we try to create division, they respond with integration." Delacroix studied the map, his strategic mind beginning to grasp the scope of what they were confronting. This isn't just African nationalism. This is something entirely new. "Yes, sir. And it's spreading." 3 days after the assassination attempt, Captain Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that would reshape global political discourse for generations to come. Instead of retreating into diplomatic security or allowing others to control the narrative of what had happened in Moscow, he chose to step directly into the light. Freedom Square in Ouagadougou had been the site of protests, celebrations, and political gatherings for decades. But on this morning, it became something different. A stage for the kind of speech that occurs perhaps once in a generation, when historical forces align and a single voice speaks for millions. Traoré stood at a simple podium with no flags, no ceremonial decorations, no symbols of state power. Behind him, the ancient walls of the city rose like testimony to civilizations that had thrived long before colonial powers had drawn their arbitrary borders across the continent. He wore his military uniform, but the insignia had been removed. The only decoration was the cracked pendant that hung at his throat, its strange luminescence visible even in the bright African sun. Before him, tens of thousands had gathered. Students from the University of Ouagadougou, farmers who had traveled from rural provinces, market vendors who had closed their stalls, former soldiers who had served in multiple armies and lived through multiple coups, but also foreigners, diplomats, journalists, and intelligence operatives who had come to witness what everyone sensed would be a moment of historical significance. When Traoré began to speak, his voice carried without amplification, trained by years of addressing troops in battle conditions where electronic systems couldn't be trusted. "My brothers and sisters," he began in French, then repeated the words in Moor, Dioula, and finally English. "We gather today not to celebrate survival, but to announce rebirth." The crowd fell silent in a way that spoke of collective recognition, the sense that something important was about to be spoken into existence. "4 days ago, someone tried to kill me in Moscow," Traoré continued, his voice carrying across the square without strain. "Not because I threatened Russia, but because I represented something that certain forces cannot tolerate, an Africa that asks permission from no one." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Traoré raised his hand for silence. "The bullet that struck me was intended to do more than end my life. It was meant to end an idea, the idea that we can govern ourselves, feed ourselves, defend ourselves, and dream for ourselves without external validation." He touched the pendant at his throat, and in the morning light, its cracked surface seemed to pulse with inner fire. But ideas, like the ancestors who forged this pendant, cannot be killed by bullets. Traoré's voice grew stronger, carrying beyond the square to radio receivers and smartphone screens across the continent. "We are not here to make war on the world. We are here to declare independence from systems that treat our sovereignty as a commodity to be traded between powers who view us as children requiring supervision." The speech continued for nearly an hour, but its central message was simple. Africa would no longer accept the role of proxy battlefield for global powers. Instead, it would chart its own course, making its own alliances, pursuing its own vision of development and security. But the most powerful moment came at the end, when Traoré addressed the global audience he knew was watching through live streams and satellite feeds. "To those who sent that bullet," he said, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting his words around the world, "I thank you. You intended to create a martyr, but instead you created something more dangerous, a living symbol of what you most fear, African unity backed by African strength." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The age of asking permission is over. The age of apologizing for our existence is finished. Africa has returned to the stage of history not as a supplicant but as an equal." The crowd's response was thunderous, but Traoré wasn't finished. "And to my fellow Africans, wherever you may be, in the villages of Mali, the cities of Nigeria, the universities of Kenya, the mines of South Africa, the farms of Zimbabwe, remember this: we are not the broken continent that appears in their documentaries. We are the children of kingdoms that built cities when their ancestors lived in forests. We are the descendants of mathematicians who calculated the movement of stars while they still believed the earth was flat." His voice rose to carry across the entire square. "We do not need their permission to be great. We only need to remember what we have always been. The video of Traoré's speech spread across the internet with viral velocity that surprised even Phoenix Network's sophisticated analysis systems. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed more than 100 million times, translated into 47 languages, and remixed into thousands of derivative videos, songs, and artistic expressions. But more importantly than its digital reach was its psychological impact. Across Africa, young people who had grown up accepting African inferiority as an unfortunate fact of global life suddenly saw a different possibility. In universities from Cairo to Cape Town, student organizations began organizing discussions about African political unity. In government offices from Accra to Addis Ababa, policymakers began quietly reaching out to their counterparts in other nations to explore new forms of cooperation. Most significantly, in military bases and security services across the continent, young officers who had been trained to view African political independence as unrealistic began to reconsider their assumptions about what was possible. The global intelligence community's response to Traoré's speech was swift and coordinated. Within hours, analysis centers in Langley, London, Moscow, and Beijing were working to understand how a relatively unknown African military officer had managed to construct what appeared to be a continent-spanning political and information network. What? They discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about African political capabilities. Phoenix Network, as intelligence analysts began calling it, wasn't built on the model of traditional revolutionary organizations. It didn't have a hierarchical command structure, centralized funding, or unified ideology. Instead, it operated more like a biological organism, a network of interconnected nodes that could function independently while contributing to collective objectives. At the technological level, Phoenix represented a synthesis of cutting-edge digital tools and ancient communication methods. Encrypted messaging systems were backed up by coded drum communications that could carry messages across hundreds of kilometers without electronic detection. Satellite internet connections were supplemented by human couriers who moved through trade routes that had been connecting African communities for millennia. But the most sophisticated aspect of Phoenix was its information strategy. Rather than trying to control narratives through propaganda or censorship, the network focused on providing tools for independent analysis. When Western media outlets published articles about African extremism, Phoenix would simultaneously release primary source documents, historical context, and analytical frameworks that allowed readers to draw their own conclusions. The approach was devastatingly effective because it didn't require people to trust African sources over Western ones. It simply provided enough information for people to recognize manipulation when they saw it. Dr. Sarah Chen, the CIA's leading analyst of African political movements, summarized the challenge in a classified report that would later be leaked by Phoenix operatives. Traditional counterinsurgency and political influence operations assume adversaries who rely on secrecy, hierarchy, and resource scarcity. Phoenix Network operates with radical transparency, distributed decision-making, and what appears to be extensive resource access through non-traditional channels. More troubling, their primary weapon appears to be truth rather than deception. They consistently release accurate information that undermines established narratives rather than promoting alternative false narratives. This makes traditional counter-propaganda techniques ineffective. Recommendation: Phoenix Network represents a new form of political organization that existing response frameworks cannot adequately address. Suggest complete review of African engagement strategy. But while intelligence analysts struggled to understand Phoenix's structure, Colonel Delacroix was preparing a more direct response. Delacroix's new strategy abandoned subtlety in favor of overwhelming force. If Phoenix Network could anticipate and counter surgical strikes, he would deploy enough chaos to overwhelm their coordination capabilities. The operation, codenamed Fracture Point, was designed to simultaneously destabilize multiple African nations through coordinated attacks on infrastructure, government institutions, and social cohesion. Unlike previous interventions that focused on installing friendly governments, Fracture Point aimed to make governance itself impossible. In the first phase, cyber attacks targeted power grids across West Africa, causing rolling blackouts that disrupted communications and commerce. Simultaneously, mercenary units began sabotaging transportation infrastructure. Bridges collapsed in Mali, railway lines were bombed in Niger, port facilities experienced mysterious explosions in Guinea. The second phase involved psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale. Deepfake videos appeared on social media showing African leaders making inflammatory statements about ethnic minorities. Fake news stories spread through messaging apps, claiming that various governments were planning mass deportations or resource seizures. Most insidiously, the operation included financial warfare designed to trigger economic collapse. Coordinated currency speculation, sudden withdrawal of development aid, and manipulation of commodity markets created artificial scarcities that drove up food prices and sparked protests across the region. But Delacroix had made the same mistake that every colonial power had made before him. He had underestimated African adaptability. Within hours of the first infrastructure attacks, alternative systems came online. Solar microgrids that had been quietly installed in rural communities over the past 3 years suddenly became critical backup power sources. Communication networks that relied on mesh topology rather than centralized hubs continued functioning even when major nodes were destroyed. More importantly, the economic warfare tactics that had been devastatingly effective against previous African governments encountered something unprecedented: continental resource sharing agreements that had been negotiated in secret over the past 2 years. When Niger's uranium mines were sabotaged, alternative supplies immediately became available through Burkina Faso's facilities. When Guinea's bauxite exports were disrupted, Mali's reserves were redirected to maintain global supply contracts. When speculation drove up food prices in Chad, surplus agricultural production from other Unity Accord nations was immediately redistributed. The speed and coordination of these responses suggested months or even years of preparation, contingency plans that had anticipated exactly the kind of comprehensive assault that Delacroix was now launching. In his Dubai command center, Delacroix watched real-time reports of his operation's failures with growing frustration. "How are they doing this?" he demanded of his intelligence team. Marcus Webb pulled up a continental map showing resource flows, communication patterns, and economic data. "Colonel, I think we've been looking at this wrong from the beginning. We've been assuming that African political unity was aspirational, something they were trying to build, but the evidence suggests they've already built it." The map showed a complex web of interconnections that had been invisible to traditional intelligence gathering. Trade relationships that appeared to involve standard commercial exchanges were actually resource-sharing agreements between governments. Cultural and educational exchanges that seemed like typical diplomatic activities were actually training programs for integrated continental defense. Most troubling, financial flows that had been dismissed as typical African corruption were actually funding streams for a parallel economic system that could function independently of Western financial institutions. "They've been preparing for this exact scenario," Webb continued. "Everything we're throwing at them, they've already gamed out and developed responses for." Delacroix studied the data with the focused intensity that had made him one of Europe's most effective strategic planners. "Then we need to change the game." The escalation came without warning, in a form that shocked even hardened intelligence professionals. Instead of targeting infrastructure or economic systems, Delacroix's next operation struck directly at human lives, specifically African civilians whose only crime was supporting continental unity. The attack occurred during a peaceful demonstration in Kigali, where thousands of Rwandans had gathered to show solidarity with the Unity Accord nations. The crowd included students, professionals, farmers, and business owners, ordinary people who had been inspired by Traoré's message of African self-determination. The explosives were planted with surgical precision, designed to maximize casualties, while creating the appearance of ethnic violence. When they detonated simultaneously at 2:17 p.m. local time, the result was carnage that would haunt the collective African consciousness for generations. People died instantly. Another 1,200 were injured, many critically. Among the dead were children who had come with their parents, elderly people who remembered the genocide and had believed such horrors were behind them, and young activists who had seen African unity as their generation's great calling. The global media response was swift and predictable. Headlines focused on tribal violence and ethnic tensions, with expert analysis suggesting that African political unity was triggering dangerous instabilities. Editorial boards in major Western newspapers called for international intervention to prevent another Rwanda-style genocide. But Phoenix Network's response was different from anything the world had seen before. Within an hour of the bombing, high-definition footage began appearing on social media platforms showing the precise placement of the explosives, the sophisticated timing mechanisms, and the professional execution that indicated military-grade planning. Facial recognition software identified several individuals in the crowd who had been photographed at previous mercenary operations in other countries. Most damning intercepted communications revealed the operational planning for the attack, including discussions of how to frame the violence as ethnic conflict and which media outlets would be most receptive to that narrative. The evidence was overwhelming, professionally presented, and impossible to dismiss as propaganda or conspiracy theory. Within 24 hours, it became clear to anyone paying attention that the Kigali bombing had been a false flag operation designed to justify international intervention in African political development. But the revelation of the truth behind the attack triggered something that Delacroix hadn't anticipated: continental rage. Across Africa, from Lagos to Luanda, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, millions of people took to the streets not in ethnic violence or political protest, but in continental mourning and unified determination. The demonstrations were peaceful but massive, organized through Phoenix Network channels, but expressing authentic popular sentiment. The message was simple and clear. Africa would not allow its children to be slaughtered to serve foreign political objectives. In Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré appeared before the Continental Parliament, a body that had been meeting in secret for 2 years, but now emerged into public view. The assembly included representatives from 47 African nations, many of whom had been working toward unity through quiet diplomatic channels rather than public declarations. When Traoré spoke to this assembly, his words were broadcast live across the continent and around the world. The blood of our brothers and sisters in Kigali has been spilled to serve interests that view African life as expendable. This is not the first time in our history that our children have been sacrificed to maintain systems that benefit others at our expense. His voice carried the weight of centuries of accumulated injustice, but also the steel of absolute determination. But it will be the last time. Today, in memory of those who died in Kigali, we declare that the era of African victimhood has ended. We will no longer be the continent where proxy wars are fought for other people's benefit. We will no longer be the source of resources for economies that offer us only poverty in return. He paused, looking directly into the cameras that were carrying his words around the world. From this moment forward, any attack on African soil will be considered an attack on all African nations. Any attempt to destabilize African governments will trigger continental response. Any effort to prevent African political development will be met with African political unity. The Continental Parliament voted unanimously to ratify what became known as the Kigali Declaration, a mutual defense pact that made an attack on any African nation equivalent to an attack on all of them. More importantly, The declaration announced the formation of the African Continental Defense Force, a military alliance that would coordinate security operations across the continent while respecting the sovereignty of individual nations. While global attention focused on the political and military implications of African unity, a quieter but equally revolutionary transformation was occurring in the economic sphere. Led by Dr. Amina Hassan, a Somali-born economist who had earned her PhD at Harvard before returning to Africa to build something entirely new, the Unity Accord nations were implementing what she called Ubuntu economics, an economic system based on African philosophical principles rather than Western or Eastern models. Ubuntu economics started from a radically different premise than capitalism or socialism. Instead of assuming that human beings were fundamentally competitive and that scarcity was the primary economic reality, Ubuntu economics assumed that cooperation was natural and that apparent scarcity was often the result of artificial restrictions on resource access. The practical applications of this philosophy were revolutionary. Instead of international trade relationships based on competitive advantage and profit maximization, Unity Accord nations negotiated resource-sharing agreements based on collective need and sustainable development. When Chad discovered significant lithium deposits, instead of auctioning mining rights to the highest international bidder, the government entered into partnerships with other African nations to develop processing facilities and battery manufacturing capabilities across the continent. When Mali's agricultural sector produced surplus grain, instead of exporting it for hard currency, the grain was distributed to food-insecure regions across the Sahel, while Mali received infrastructure development support from nations with different resource endowments. Most significantly, Unity Accord nations began trading with each other using a continental currency backed not by gold or foreign reserves, but by collective African resource wealth. The African Continental Unit, ACU, was designed to facilitate intra-African trade while reducing dependence on dollar-denominated international markets. The economic transformation was subtle but profound. For the first time since colonization, African nations were building economic relationships with each other that weren't mediated by European or American financial institutions. Dr. Hassan explained the philosophy in a presentation to the African Development Bank that was later broadcast across the continent. Ubuntu tells us that I am because we are. In economic terms, this means that individual prosperity is meaningless without collective prosperity. A Chad that becomes wealthy from lithium mining while Niger remains impoverished is not success. It's failure to understand our fundamental interconnection. The results were measurable and impressive. Intra-African trade, which had historically represented less than 15% of total African commerce, increased by 400% within 18 months of Ubuntu economics implementation. More importantly, this trade was increasingly conducted in African currencies rather than dollars or euros, reducing the continent's vulnerability to external financial manipulation. But the most revolutionary aspect of Ubuntu economics was its approach to what Dr. Hassan called intellectual sovereignty. Instead of importing technological solutions developed for other contexts, African nations began investing heavily in research and development specifically designed for African conditions and priorities. Universities across the continent established new partnerships focused on solving distinctly African challenges: drought-resistant agriculture, solar energy systems optimized for equatorial conditions, mobile communication technologies that could function in remote areas, and medical research. Focused on diseases that primarily affected African populations, the investment was massive and coordinated. Nations that were supposedly too poor to fund basic education suddenly found resources to establish world-class research facilities. Countries that had historically relied on foreign technical assistance began producing innovations that other continents sought to license. The explanation wasn't miraculous, it was mathematical. When African nations stopped exporting raw materials at artificially low prices and importing finished goods at inflated costs, enormous amounts of capital became available for domestic investment. when African governments stopped servicing external debt that had been incurred by previous regimes for projects that primarily benefited foreign contractors. Resources were freed up for infrastructure and education. When African central banks stopped maintaining foreign currency reserves to satisfy international credit ratings and instead focused on facilitating domestic economic activity, capital markets that had been stunted for decades began to flourish. Ubuntu economics wasn't just an alternative to Western economic models. It was proof that those models had been deliberately designed to prevent African economic development, rather than to promote it. As the physical and economic dimensions of African unity became increasingly visible, the digital warfare intensified to unprecedented levels. Phoenix Network found itself under constant attack from some of the world's most sophisticated cyber warfare units, but their distributed architecture and innovative security protocols proved remarkably resilient. The key to Phoenix's digital defense was a concept that Amara Kone called democratic cryptography. Instead of relying on centralized security systems that could be compromised by sufficiently powerful attackers, Phoenix used encryption methods that distributed security across thousands of individual users. Every smartphone, laptop, and internet-connected device in the Phoenix network functioned as both a communication node and a security validator. Messages weren't just encrypted, they were verified by multiple independent sources before being accepted as authentic. More importantly, the system was designed to become stronger under attack. When hostile forces attempted to overwhelm Phoenix communications with spam, false information, or denial of service attacks, the network's algorithms automatically adapted to filter out malicious content while improving the signal strength of legitimate communications. The result was an information ecosystem that operated according to completely different principles than traditional internet architecture. Instead of centralized platforms controlled by corporate or government entities, Phoenix created what they called information Ubuntu, a system where truth emerged through collective verification rather than institutional authority. When Western media outlets published stories claiming that African unity was leading to human rights abuses, Phoenix users could immediately access primary source documentation, witness testimonies, and independent verification of the claims being made. When social media bots attempted to spread divisive content designed to inflame ethnic or religious tensions, the democratic cryptography system automatically identified and quarantined the false information while highlighting credible sources that provided accurate context. Most powerfully, when government agencies attempted to spread disinformation about African political developments, Phoenix's verification systems could trace the source of false narratives back to their origins, exposing the propaganda operations in real time. The system's effectiveness was demonstrated during what became known as the Week of Digital Thunder, when coordinated cyber attacks from multiple state and non-state actors attempted to completely disable African internet infrastructure. The attacks were sophisticated and comprehensive. Power grids were targeted to disrupt internet service providers. Submarine internet cables were physically severed. Satellite communication systems were jammed. Social media platforms were flooded with automated content designed to make meaningful communication impossible. For a traditional internet ecosystem, such attacks would have been catastrophic. But Phoenix Network not only survived, it thrived. When centralized internet infrastructure was disabled, mesh networks of smartphones and laptops automatically created alternative communication pathways. When submarine cables were cut, satellite, uplinks, and radio relay systems maintained continental connectivity. When social media platforms were compromised, Phoenix's own communication protocols continued functioning with even higher efficiency. Most remarkably, the attempted digital siege actually strengthened Phoenix's capabilities by forcing rapid innovations in decentralized communication technology. Dr. Kwame Asante, who had become Phoenix's chief architect, explained the philosophy in a technical, presentation that was simultaneously broadcast through conventional internet channels and Phoenix's alternative network. Traditional internet architecture assumes that communication requires permission from central authorities, internet service providers, platform companies, government regulators. But communication is a fundamental human activity that existed long before these institutions. Phoenix Network simply recognizes that people can communicate directly with each other without asking permission from corporations or governments. The technology makes this recognition practical on a continental scale. The implications extended far beyond Africa. As news of Phoenix's resilience spread, similar networks began emerging in other regions where people felt that their communication freedoms were being restricted by governmental or corporate censorship. The emergence of a unified Africa as an independent political and economic force triggered responses from global powers that ranged from panic to grudging admiration to outright hostility. In Washington, the National Security Council convened emergency sessions to address what classified documents referred to as the African Challenge. The problem wasn't military. Despite their continental defense agreements, Unity Accord nations showed no signs of aggressive expansion or territorial ambitions beyond their own borders. Instead, the challenge was what Pentagon analysts called gravitational influence, the tendency of other developing nations to begin adopting African political and economic innovations. In South America, indigenous movements began citing Traoré's speeches and Ubuntu economics principles in their campaigns for greater autonomy from traditional political parties. In Southeast Asia, young political leaders started organizing continental cooperation agreements modeled on the Unity Accord. Most troubling for established powers, European and North American citizens began asking uncomfortable questions about why their own governments couldn't provide the kind of transparent governance, economic security, and technological innovation that were becoming commonplace in Unity Accord nations. Dr. Margaret Blackwood, the State Department's leading expert on African political systems, summarized the challenge in a classified briefing that was later leaked by Phoenix Network sources. The Unity Accord represents the first successful example of post-colonial political organization that doesn't rely on Western institutional models or Chinese state capitalism. Its success undermines fundamental assumptions about economic development, democratic governance, and international relations. More dangerous than its military capabilities is its demonstration effect. If African nations can achieve rapid economic development, technological innovation, and political stability without Western guidance or financial assistance, it raises questions about why other regions haven't achieved similar results, despite decades of international aid and development. Programs. Recommendation. Avoid direct confrontation, which would likely strengthen African unity while weakening U.S. credibility. Instead, focus on supporting internal divisions within the Unity Accord and demonstrating the superiority of Western models through our own domestic achievements. But even as Washington strategists debated response options, public opinion in the United States was shifting in ways that complicated any aggressive approach to African unity. Phoenix Network's transparent communication strategies had created a generation of global citizens who were accustomed to accessing primary source information rather than relying solely on traditional media narratives. When American college students could watch live streams of Unity Accord parliamentary debates, read translated versions of African economic policy documents, and communicate directly with African young people through Phoenix channels, it became difficult for U.S. media to maintain narratives about African political instability or economic incompetence. More significantly, African technological innovations were beginning to have practical applications that benefited people around the world. Solar energy systems developed for African conditions proved highly effective in rural areas of the American Southwest. Mobile banking technologies designed for African infrastructure limitations revolutionized financial services in underserved American communities. Ubuntu economics principles were being adopted by American cooperative businesses, worker-owned enterprises, and community development organizations that found African approaches to resource sharing more effective than traditional capitalist models. The result was a complex political environment where official U.S. policy toward Africa remained cautious and somewhat hostile, while American civil society was increasingly receptive to African innovations and perspectives. In Europe, the response was more directly confrontational. The European Union, facing its own internal divisions and economic challenges, viewed African unity as a direct threat to European political and economic interests. European companies had invested hundreds of billions of euros in African resource, extraction, manufacturing, and financial services based on the assumption that African political fragmentation would ensure continued access to cheap labor and raw materials. When Unity Accord nations began renegotiating these arrangements to ensure that more of the economic value remained in Africa, European corporate profits declined dramatically. More troubling, African technological and educational achievements were attracting European young people who saw more opportunity for meaningful careers in rapidly developing African cities than in economically stagnant European capitals. The European Commission's response was to implement what they called economic defense measures, trade restrictions, financial sanctions, and diplomatic pressure designed to force Unity Accord nations back into traditional client relationships with European powers. But these measures proved counterproductive. Instead of weakening African unity, European aggression strengthened continental solidarity while accelerating African efforts to build economic independence. When the EU restricted African agricultural exports, Unity Accord nations simply redirected their products to Asian and Middle Eastern markets that offered better prices and more respectful trading relationships. When European banks limited credit access for African development projects, Ubuntu economics principles enabled African nations to finance infrastructure and technology investments through resource sharing and continental cooperation. Most significantly, when European governments restricted visa access for African citizens, Phoenix Network enabled African businesses, universities, and cultural organizations to build direct relationships with European civil society that bypassed government restrictions. The result was that European attempts to isolate Africa ended, isolating Europe instead. 6 months after the assassination attempt, Captain Ibrahim Traoré returned to Moscow, not as a secret visitor, but as the elected president of the Unity Accord nations, a continental federation that represented more than 800 million people and controlled some of the world's most valuable mineral and energy resources. The circumstances of his return were dramatically different from his first visit. Instead of arriving on an unmarked aircraft under cover of darkness, President Traoré's delegation flew on African Continental Airlines Flight 001, a customized aircraft that served as the mobile headquarters for Unity Accord diplomacy. The delegation included not just political leaders, but also scientists, economists, artists, and young people who represented the full spectrum of African achievement and aspiration. When they landed at Moscow's Sheremetyevo International Airport, they were greeted by crowds of Russian citizens who had been following African developments through Phoenix Network channels and wanted to express their solidarity with African independence. The official meetings took place not in the Kremlin's intimidating ceremonial chambers, but in a conference facility that had been specifically designed for the new era of African diplomacy. The room featured African art, comfortable seating arranged in circles rather than confrontational lines, and translation equipment that could handle the multiple languages spoken by Unity Accord representatives. Putin, now facing his own domestic challenges as Russian citizens demanded reforms inspired by African political innovations, approached the negotiations from a position of strategic necessity rather than strength. "Mr. President," Putin began, using Traoré's new title with careful formality, "I believe we have mutual interests in establishing productive relationships between our nations. Traoré smiled, his hand unconsciously touching the pendant that had become a symbol of African resilience. President Putin, I appreciate your recognition of African sovereignty. That's an important first step toward the kind of partnership we're interested in building. The negotiations that followed established principles that would reshape international relations for decades to come. Instead of traditional great power bargaining where stronger nations impose terms on weaker ones, the Unity Accord insisted on relationships based on genuine equality and mutual benefit. When Russia offered to provide military equipment in exchange for mineral extraction rights, Unity Accord negotiators countered with proposals for technology sharing that would build African manufacturing capabilities rather than just extracting African resources. When Russian energy companies sought exclusive drilling rights, African representatives proposed joint ventures that would ensure significant portions of energy revenues remained in Africa for continental development projects. Most significantly, when Putin suggested traditional spheres of influence arrangements, where Africa would align with Russian foreign policy in exchange for security guarantees, Traoré politely but firmly declined. President Putin, Unity Accord nations are interested in friendly relationships with Russia, but we're not interested in replacing Western domination with Eastern domination. We want partnerships, not patronage. The final agreements reflected African diplomatic innovation rather than traditional great power politics. Instead of military alliances or economic dependence relationships, the accords established what became known as Ubuntu partnerships, agreements based on shared benefit, mutual respect, and long-term sustainability rather than short-term advantage. Russia would provide advanced technology and technical expertise for African development projects, but the technology would be transferred rather than just licensed, ensuring that African engineers and scientists could further develop and improve the innovations. Africa would provide rare earth minerals and energy resources, but through joint ventures where African nations retained controlling interests and significant portions of profits were reinvested in African education and infrastructure. Most importantly, both sides agreed to support each other's sovereignty against external interference, but without requiring either to compromise their independent foreign policy decision-making. The Moscow Accords, as they became known, established a new template for international relations that prioritized mutual development over competitive advantage. 1 year after the bullet that was meant to silence African independence, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York. But he wasn't there to seek recognition or legitimacy from the international community. Instead, he came to announce that Africa was ready to offer partnership and assistance to other regions seeking their own paths to sovereignty and development. The speech began with words that would be remembered as a turning point in global political consciousness. Honorable delegates, distinguished guests, fellow citizens of the world, I stand before you today not as a supplicant seeking approval, but as the representative of a continent that has rediscovered its voice and reclaimed its destiny. Traoré's presence at the podium represented more than individual political achievement. Behind him sat delegations from 52 African nations, many of whom had governments that had been elected through new democratic processes inspired by Ubuntu principles of consensus building and collective responsibility. 1 year ago, someone tried to kill me because they believed that silencing one voice could prevent a continent from speaking. They were wrong about many things, but most importantly, they were wrong about the nature of the voice they were trying to silence. His hand touched the pendant at his throat, still cracked, still glowing with its strange inner light, now recognized around the world as a symbol of African resilience. The voice that spoke through me in Moscow was not my voice alone. It was the voice of every African ancestor who died fighting for freedom, every African child who dared to dream beyond the limitations others set for them, every African scientist who solved problems the world's experts claimed were unsolvable. The General Assembly Hall was silent in a way that veteran diplomats had never experienced. This wasn't the usual polite attention given to ceremonial speeches, but the focused listening of people who sensed they were witnessing history. Today, I am here to announce that Africa is ready to share what we have learned, not because we believe our solutions are perfect, but because we believe the principles that guided our transformation, sovereignty, cooperation, and respect for human dignity, are universal. What followed was the announcement of the Global Ubuntu Initiative, a program that would make African political, economic, and technological innovations available to any nation or community that wanted to adapt them to their own circumstances. The initiative included open-source access to Phoenix Network's democratic communication technologies, technical assistance for implementing Ubuntu economics principles, educational exchanges that would allow students from around the world to study African political and economic innovations, and most importantly, solidarity networks that would support other regions' efforts to build sovereignty and self-determination. We do not seek to build an African empire, Traoré concluded. We seek to build a world where every nation, every community, every individual has the opportunity to develop their full potential without asking permission from powers that view their growth as a threat. The response was immediate and global. Within hours of Traoré's speech, requests for Ubuntu Initiative assistance began arriving from indigenous communities in the Americas, rural regions in Europe, urban neighborhoods in Asia, and island nations in the Pacific. More significantly, the speech catalyzed political movements in developed nations where citizens began demanding why their own governments couldn't provide the transparency, economic security, and technological innovation that had become commonplace in Unity Accord countries. In the United States, the Ubuntu Democrats emerged as a political force advocating for cooperative economics and participatory democracy. In Europe, the sovereignty movement began organizing for continental political structures that prioritized citizen welfare over corporate profit. In China, underground networks began circulating translations of African political philosophy and experimenting with consensus-based decision-making in their communities. 5 years after the assassination attempt that was meant to end African political independence, the world had changed in ways that few could have predicted. Africa wasn't just unified, it had become a model for political and economic organization that was being adapted across the globe. Unity Accord nations had achieved economic growth rates that exceeded even the most optimistic projections, not through exploitation of resources or labor, but through innovations in cooperative production and sustainable development. African universities had become centers of global learning, attracting students and researchers from around the world who wanted to study Ubuntu economics, democratic cryptography, and other African innovations. Most remarkably, African cities had become destinations for young people from Europe and North America who saw more opportunity and freedom in rapidly developing African urban centers than in their home countries. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, now in his second term, as president of Unity Accord nations, occasionally took out the bullet that had nearly killed him in Moscow. He kept it in a simple frame on his desk, not as a reminder of mortality, but as proof of transformation, the pendant that had stopped. The bullet had never lost its strange luminescence. Scientists had examined it extensively, but its composition remained mysterious, a combination of terrestrial minerals and elements that appeared to have originated beyond Earth. Whether it had truly fallen from the sky or had been waiting in African soil for generations, no one could determine. But its symbolic power had grown beyond its physical properties. Replicas were worn by young people around the world who wanted to demonstrate their commitment to sovereignty, cooperation, and human dignity. The cracked surface had become an artistic motif that appeared in paintings, sculptures, and architectural designs. More importantly, the principles that the pendant represented, that truth could survive bullets, that unity was stronger than division, that sovereignty was worth defending, had become part of global political consciousness. On quiet evenings, Traoré would sometimes walk through the streets of Ouagadougou, now a gleaming metropolis that combined African architectural traditions with cutting-edge environmental technologies. Children who had grown up in the Unity Accord era played games that their grandparents couldn't have imagined, switching effortlessly between local languages and continental communications, solving mathematical problems with techniques developed in African universities, dreaming of careers in industries that had been created by African innovation. These children had never known a world where Africa was considered backward or dependent. For them, African leadership in technology, politics, and economics was simply the natural order of things. And sometimes, when the light caught his pendant just right, Traoré would smile and remember the moment when history turned, not because of the bullet that was fired, but because of the truth that refused to die. The age of asking permission was indeed over. Africa had risen not through conquest or domination, but through the simple revolutionary act of believing in itself. And around the world, other voices were beginning to speak the same words that had echoed from Moscow to Ouagadougou to the United Nations. We do not fear shadows. We come from the sun. The phoenix had risen, and its flight was just beginning. Author's note: this story explores themes of sovereignty, cooperation, and human dignity through the lens of African political development. While fictional, it draws inspiration from real struggles for independence and self-determination that continue around the world. The character of Captain Ibrahim Traoré represents the countless individuals who have risked everything to advance human freedom and dignity. The technological and economic innovations described in this story, democratic cryptography, Ubuntu economics, Phoenix Network, are speculative but based on real developments in decentralized technology, cooperative economics, and grassroots communication systems. Most importantly, this story is dedicated to the idea that every community, every nation, every individual has the right to develop their full potential without asking permission from powers that view their growth as a threat. The age of waiting is over. Stay loud, stay sharp, stay free.